Olá, pessoal. Dentro do projeto Bora Falar de Branding, que acima de tudo tem como propósito de valor conseguir discutir diferentes aspectos que estão ligados ao conceito maior de gestão de marca, nós vamos conversar hoje com um especialista global. Nós vamos conversar com o senhor Kevin Keller. Ele é reitor da Universidade Tufts School of Business dos Estados Unidos. Ele é reitor da parte de marketing e comunicação. Ele tem livros publicados, aqui mesmo no Brasil a gente tem um livro sobre gestão de marca publicado por ele, e ele, durante toda a sua vida, em vários artigos, papers acadêmicos, ele fez várias proposições que a gente utiliza dentro da gestão, dentro da criação de todo um conceito de marcas. Então a gente vai ter a oportunidade de conversar com ele, entender a visão dele dentro do contexto atual do que é marca, sua relevância, sua abrangência, seus pilares, acima de tudo. E a gente vai ter todas as questões, elas estão aqui num paper que foi criado, todas essas questões foram desenvolvidas junto com outros participantes do Bora Falar de Branding. Então, se você quer, clica aqui embaixo, se inscreve no canal para poder receber atualizações sobre o Bora Falar de Branding, sobre outros programas, outros episódios, acima de tudo. Aproveita e vai lá no LinkedIn, onde a gente tem a oportunidade de trocar, você sugerir outras pessoas, outros temas, outros olhares, e fazer cada vez uma proposta do Bora Falar de Branding ainda melhor. Então, eu vou parar por um minuto, vamos colocar para dentro, vamos receber e colocar dentro da sala o senhor Keller para a gente conversar, para que ele apresente para a gente toda a visão do que está sendo debatido globalmente, da melhor forma de fazer branding dentro do nosso contexto social, econômico, político atual. Tá bom? A gente já volta já. Só um minutinho, tá bom? Grande abraço. Ok, pessoal, estamos aqui com o Mr. Kevin Keller, né, o reitor da Universidade Tufts School of Business. Mr. Keller, we are very proud to have you here with us at this program, Bora Falar de Branding. That's something like, let's start talking about branding.
That sounds great. It's my pleasure to be here.
Okay, and just for a start, I'm a fan of your books and articles, papers in general. As a teacher, I read a lot. And for example, in my MBA classes, when we start to talking about branding, the first slide, the brand definition, the first brand definition that I use, it's yours. I will read that. Branding is a structured process that guarantees the continuous improvement of the delivery of the brand promise. And I put underline on that, brand promise. From the definition of the promise to the implementation in all its contact points with a strategic audience. So I think it's complete. It's complete itself. As everything is changing all the time, do you understand that is still the best definition for a brand, or in your opinion, there is a new one?
Well, I mean, I think I would say there's always been different, definitions and ways to think about branding. I like, I've developed my kind of terminology, my thinking, and it's evolved some over the years. But I think the function, you got to remember, brands have been around for centuries, and the functions that they do and how they operate in different ways have always been the case. So it's just, I think, finding what ways that you're comfortable with and how you'd like to think about brands and branding. And so that's one of the things I've tried to do is come up with my philosophy and try to express that in my my writing and my books and those definitions to try to capture that. For me, I always have a strong customer flavor, really focusing on the consumer, and whether it's or individual or a business, and I always think about the head and the heart, how they think and they feel and how they act and what brands mean, which, brand meaning. And I talk about knowledge, but knowledge in terms of thoughts, feelings, associations, I still think that's fundamental. I think there are all kinds of influences that maybe have changed, but I think the basic notion of brands providing information and providing meaning and providing value to customers in different ways still holds true. And so it's just thinking about how to, what to do with the value, how to create the value, how to deliver it, how to communicate it. And the role of the brand is part of that. I still think holds true, but it's something that, again, they're always looking for other definitions and other ways to try to explain and understand branding, so that would be helpful for people.
I started this web series. Let's talk about branding, because inside this concept of branding, it's like a solar system. There are lots, as you said, there are lots of things related with this: the design, the points of contacts, customers, in fact, all the stakeholders, the promise, the storytelling, the tone of voice, a lot of things that makes what we, as we say, as a branding.
That's right, and I think that's why I think I enjoyed so much writing my textbook, was to try to think of how to organize all those different things.
Yeah,
because there is a whole lot that kind of comes into play, and it's very, it's so central part of marketing, and it has a lot of the scope that marketing has. And just as you said, you can talk about product design, and you can talk about the way the brand is
portfolio
sold.
Strategy, and so on.
Yeah, tactics, strategy, and so all of that kind of gets factored in. So there is, and that's why it's a fascinating study, a subject to study. It's also a fascinating subject to practice and actually try to build brands and make brands strong, because there are so many different inputs and decisions you have to make.
And I think that is our biggest challenge, is to communicate how important is the branding. Because the normal people see just like, it's just the logo. It's not the logo. We're not talking about this. We're talking the whole concept. There is much more positioning and so on than just a logo. Logo is just one chapter, not the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree. It's in getting people beyond just, and even when they're thinking about the brand itself, it's not just the name, it's more than that. It's the logo, the symbol, the characters and slogans and packaging and signage, all the things that you have that you can use to trademark. So I agree. It's so much more than that. But I will say, from when I started, because I started almost probably 35 years ago, started studying branding. And when I first started, I don't think the concept of branding was as well understood by the general population and people as it is now. I think people have learned a lot about branding. It's part of the vocabulary. People talk about their own brands in different ways. So it's really evolved a lot. That said, people still sometimes have very narrow views of it.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the second question. Under the consumer eye, we can separate the benefits into three main pillars: the categories according to the underlying motivations. And when we say that, we are, as a triangle, we are saying about the functional benefits. That's the most intrinsic advantage of the product or service. The experiential benefits, what the consumer feels when you use my brand, for example. I want to show my power. I want to show how rich am I, or something like that. And the symbolic benefits, the most extrinsic advantage of the product or service, for example. That's usually correspond this symbolic to attributes not related to the products, but related with the social approval. For example, if I buy an electric car, a hybrid car, it's symbolic. I'm talking to the people where I'm concerned about the field, the climate change, and so on. Thinking about our social context nowadays, do you think that we are living the symbolic age for brands? Is it still possible to be just a functional brand?
Yeah, no, good question. I think there's always been a need to be more than a functional brand, but at the same time, I also feel like you have to have some to have some aspects of and dimensions of your brand that are functional, more functional in nature. So let me explain that a little bit. So I think that the strongest brands provide multiple kinds of benefits. So some of them are more performance related, they're more functional, they're more intrinsic to the category itself and the benefits that a consumer, he or she, is seeking. But then there's also other kinds of benefits that are more experiential, that are more what it's like to use the brand, that go beyond just maybe the physical product or even the service, the actual service, and the other intangibles. And then there's the more symbolic and emotional and all of those very intangible and more extrinsic associations. Strong brands, the best brands, have all three, and they find ways to combine them and so that they're linked. And that's probably one of the most important points. So it's not as if I can just layer on and combine emotions separate from the product. The strongest brands link them. You can look at Nike and Apple and BMW and just Starbucks and Red Bull. You can kind of go down the list, and they all have functional benefits, they all have experiential benefits, and they all have symbolic and emotional benefits. So I think connecting those are really the key. Clearly, I think in today's world, the symbolic and the emotional has become more important than it was maybe in decades past. For different reasons, I think that's happened. But I wouldn't forget about the importance of functional, because I think that foundation to a brand is really critical. And I think it's too easy to sort of say, well, all the brand's functions are the same. They can't position and differentiate on the basis of performance. But I think having some aspect and some foundation of the brand there is so critical to build these other associations, the experiential and then the symbolic. And you almost think of them as three circles with the functional, and then you sort of surround them. And that's the way you want to think about it, is you want your brand to have that core, but more than that in a really rich way. So that's the thing I would, strongly kind of encourage, is that kind of thinking about not being satisfied not being satisfied until I differentiate and continue to differentiate myself along all three dimensions.
Okay, but I was thinking here, for example, if you will think, for example, Airbnb, for example, they, in my opinion, they are in the symbolic. I as a consumer, I don't want to stay at a normal, regular hotel. I want to be as a living person in that city. So it's more symbolic. Am I right?
Well, I mean, Airbnb, the thing I'd say with Airbnb, symbolic may be part of it, that there's something about what it represents, but there's a pretty functional aspect of Airbnb, and it's a little bit like Uber, sort of the same thing. They're coming, these disruptive brands, and there are many of those that are out there. The main thing, what they do is they're going into categories and saying, we're going to give you some fundamentally different benefits. We're going to satisfy your needs in different ways. And so you don't need to be in a hotel. You don't need to call a taxi. So you can go through all of these different examples. And I think they often have a pretty strong functional difference. And where it lies is they're actually redefining the categories. So it's sort of, this is not, we're not in the hotel category. We're in the overnight stay category.
Yeah.
We're not in the taxi category or whatever. We're in the, the transportation, the short-term transportation, however you want to think of that. So I think they start there. And I think what's interesting for those brands is how do they build, what kind of emotions, what kinds of other intangibles they kind of create with their brands, and how Uber's a good example, because
Netflix is another example.
Netflix is another example, exactly. And they disrupt, and then where they do it through their redefining the category, creating almost their own new category, if you will. but then also they, just like we said, any brand, you've got to be more than functional. So what are the emotional, symbolic ties that you're able to create to make sure that you are building a strong brand? Because a strong brand has that functional performance at the core, like we said, but it goes beyond that. And that's where sort of, and is it something about the way you treat your employees, what you do for the community, in what ways? Is it what kind of emotional associations do I get from the brand through the way you communicate about yourself or the way you deliver the service? So there's all kinds of ways to do it. But I think that's the interesting, for the disruptive brands, they get a huge head start building their brand by the fact that they're so different typically in a good way, if they're good disruptors. But then how do you build on that and take advantage of maybe being seen as innovative, exciting? Those are there's some nice associations that go with that kind of pioneering spirit of a disruptive brand.
Okay. We are talking about the changes in our world that we are seeing. For example, nowadays, concepts like anytime, anywhere, omnichannel are very strong in our society. In your opinion, what's the role of the brand today surrounded by these concepts?
Yeah, the thing with brands, one of the basic functions of brands I always think is so important, or some basic functions of brands, is this whole idea of simplifying decision making and making life easier and reducing risk. And so that's always kind of
sorry for that. I like that. To be the decision make more simple. I need to buy a TV. There's one strong brand like Samsung, Panasonic, or so on, and there's a brand that I have never heard about that. Same price. What I'm going to buy? Of course, the brands there I know. Sorry for interrupt you, but no, I like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's just, and to your point, it's how it makes people feel better. They feel more confident when they choose. They feel there's less risk, so more security, if you will. And so that ability of a brand to deliver on the promise, to make people's lives a little easier, a little better, that's the function. And that's always going to be the case in a very complex world. The ability to simplify is critical. That said, part of what brands have to be able to do is deal with a more complex world, deal with omnichannel, deal with different kinds of pricing, situations and contexts, deal with integrated communications and all the different digital and platforms and everything else.
Yeah.
So there still needs to be integration. There needs to be, really some great marketing that goes with that brand, all towards the goal of building a brand that makes people's lives, easier, simpler, and better. Because that is the function that brands have that people have always valued, and I think always will value.
Okay, very good. I will read the next question because it's very familiar to me. During the classes, many students ask me a simple question. Branding is the soul of the marketing, and the market is done with branding. In your opinion, is there a frontier, a borderline of what is responsibility of branding and marketing, or as we say in Brazil, all together and mix it?
Yeah, I like that Brazilian expression. It is all together. It's a great question, and I think, and often we talk about brand marketing, we actually combine them into one little short phrase.
Okay.
The idea of marketing for the brand. I think so we talk about branding and marketing, if you will, and think of it that way. I think they're obviously really related. I think marketing, in many ways, you could think of it as having a broader scope, but branding has a broad scope too, because branding involves not just my marketing. I can do other things to build my brand that go beyond my marketing and in fact will affect my brand. outside influences, what other people say, word of mouth and PR and other things that may impact that. So it's interesting. I think of them as really closely related. The big difference with branding is you are sort of focusing on the brand. The brand becomes sort of the centerpiece in ways that marketing can be even broader, I think, in terms of the focus, if you will. But if you think of the activities, the notion of what marketing does and what branding would do, you'd say, well, a lot of your marketing is to build the brand and in different ways. So I see them as really closely related. The way I would do it is I would draw the concentric circles and have a lot of overlap, because I think there's so much of it is the same, because one of the most important things for an organization is to have a strong brand. One of the most important things for an organization is to do good marketing. One of the most important things for an organization is to do good marketing to build a strong brand.
Well, based on my experience, there are some companies that brand and market performing together. And of course, they do a very important role. But there are some companies that they are like silos. They are not performing well aligned. It's a misunderstanding of the concept.
Yeah, no, I think the more an organization understands, one, that marketing isn't just done by the marketing department, that the whole organization in effect does marketing. One, and two, same thing. It's the branding can't just be done by the marketing department either. The whole organization, through what they say, what they do, how they interact with customers, how they interact with the public, all of that affects what people think and feel about the brand. So ultimately people play that role. So I think it's very important that it's sort of it's all built within the organization so that everyone sort of appreciates the importance of the brand and how they can help or hurt. And in effect, they're doing some of the marketing. That said, the marketing department does some very important work that's more specific, but it builds on the work of many other people in the organization who are doing other things that impact that customer experience.
Okay, very nice. Companies today, because the quarterly reports, the report that we send to shareholders every quarter, companies today tend to think in the short term, not in the long term. But branding, it's a long-term construction. So how to deal with this short-term against long-term conflict, or is not a conflict?
Well, it can be, but I think the key is to make sure it's not a conflict. So I think as much as possible, what you try to do is try to understand the long-term implications of your short-term actions and try to do things that both sell your product in the short run and build your brand in the long run. And there's a lot of things you can do that can do both if you try. And I think that's, to me, really, really critical. So I'll give you an example: promotions, sales promotions. So just basic sales promotions. You're discounting. You're trying to get short-term sales. Well, I can do and be creative, and I can make sure I'm strategic in my promotions in a way to reinforce some of my key associations, some of my positioning, some of my strategy for my brand. So that to me is, so promotions are a good example where, if done right, I should do two things. I should sell my product and I should build my brand long term. And that's ideal, because that's what I want to do. I want to achieve both of those. I have to have short-term sales. I have to. But long-term, I need to have a strong brand. So I need to do both. And I think the more strategic you are in thinking tactically and blending things in really smart ways with your brand, the more likely you can be to do that. And that's where some of the art and science, I think, of marketing and branding really come into play.
But let me get down this answer just to my understanding. Let's think of, for example, for a luxury brands. Okay, also you are positioning your luxury brand for the high level of the society. It's your long-term thinking. or you have to sell now, and you are doing promotions in a low cheap price. It's not a conflict where I want to positioning and what I'm doing now. It's not a conflict, just for my understanding.
Well, if again, there are things I can do that compromise my brand promise to sell, and that's the thing I have to be careful about. That's the conflict part, where I actually, if I'm not careful, so let's say I overly discount, I'm always on sale, then that's going to erode the quality perceptions. It's going to reduce the price integrity and the value integrity of the brand. It's going to come at a cost. So there are things I can do, and I will say the vertical dimension of branding is always the heart. The pricing and where you are and how you discount, that's always complicated. You have to handle that, be careful with that in terms of where you are and how you discount. So that particular issue, and that is one where you might see more conflict if you do things too much in the short run without factoring in how to do it in a way that's consistent with your long-term brand strategy. So even if I'm a luxury brand and I'm doing those discounts, I've got to do it in a way that feels consistent with the brand promise, that makes it feel like it's the way the brand's doing. It's consistent with what the brand should be doing. And the consumer will give permission for that and not feel like it's inappropriate or something that doesn't make sense. But that's the really critical thing, is to do it in a brand consistent way. And that's why I love the expression, is it on brand? In other words, is it consistent with the brand strategy?
Okay. We are living the start of a new companies, the venture capital financing, small apps, small new companies, new ventures, something like that. Developing a branding project in some ways, it's not a cheap investment. It's a high level investment. How your recommendation to implement a good branding project for small entrepreneurships?
A couple things I'd say, and one is this is actually an example where the brand itself really matters, because it's one of the best investments you can make, is to choose a good name, to come up with a good brand identity, a certain look, having a good slogan. I think slogans are very powerful branding tools because they capture your positioning. They help people understand you better in just a few words. So one is to come up with a really, really creative, well-designed, set of brand elements, the way you brand yourself. Second thing is, the most important thing in any brand is the experience the customers have. That's how you build a great brand. I always come back to, great brands are built out of opportunity. There's some unmet need, and we talked about Uber before, we talked about Airbnb before. So we talked about Starbucks, we talked about Red Bull. You can go down the list of those kinds of brands that have been built and created over the last 15, 20, 25 years, whatever. The common denominator, the ingredient, is that satisfying unmet needs and then relentlessly delivering on that brand promise. And so that is, if you want to build your entrepreneur, you want to build a new brand, that's the best way to do it, is that having that experience. And so people then talk. So the beauty of that is, if I do that well, just like Starbucks did years and years and years ago, you don't have to advertise as much. People write about you, people talk about you. So you get all the benefits of word of mouth. You get all the benefits of press and publicity and public relations. And so you get all that good media coverage. So all of that comes from having a great experience. So you want to brand yourself well, and you want to deliver that good experience. And then obviously the third part is whatever marketing you can afford in your budget, you want to do really, really well.
Let me just add one thing in your answer, that is to define clear the value proposition.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the big problem.
Yeah.
I want to be everything for everybody. No, forget it.
Yeah, no, great point. And that's, you've got to make sure your strategy, and we were focusing very tactically on the brand building, but there's a strategic part up front, which is crucial in targeting and segmentation and positioning and value propositions and the brand promise and all of that you want to make sure that is all that feeds into your choice of your brand elements, your development of creating these great experiences, the marketing that you do, all those things. So yeah, I totally agree.
Okay, thank you. In your opinion, there is another fake dilemma. In your opinion, is there a difference between branding for traditional companies and brand for digital companies? Or is everything branding, and I'm aligning with that, or is everything branding and follows the same methodology?
Well, I mean, there's always going to be some special kind of rules or considerations within certain types of brands, whether it's services or professional services, business to business versus business to consumer, digital brands, online brands versus offline brands, physical products, all that. There'll be some special considerations. That said, a lot of the core factors and decisions that you have to make there's going to be a lot of commonality across all of those. So a lot of what we've talked about, we've focused on more of those kinds of ideas and concepts and thinking that applies across the board. But there's certainly some special things you have to think about. If I'm digital, in terms of what kind of brand promise I create, but more importantly, how I sort of actually market myself, how I do the branding, if you will, online, is just going to be very different than an offline experience. If I'm selling a product or I'm creating a service somewhere or something like that, physical service. So, but otherwise, so I think there's a lot of commonality with some special applications, if you will.
I like to think that we have toolboxes and we use the same concepts for traditional or digital companies, but at the last mile, we use maybe different tools for traditional and for digital, but the concept is the same.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it, because there is a lot of that toolbox where a lot of the tools you're going to take out no matter what. And then there are going to be some tools that are more specific as you're going to work on a brand. They're specific for just that. But there are fewer of those than there probably are than the tools that kind of work for a lot of brands. The basic strategy, a lot of the basic branding concepts that we talked about kind of apply, and those tools can be used for almost any kind of brand.
Okay, let's talk about brands and social media. In times of social media, companies are no longer black boxes, but castles of glass, transparent, in which society observes everything, and it's possible to see and comment on everything about the company, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. How should brands position themselves in a social media age?
Yeah, good question. I think that in some ways it's almost the way you ask the question. It's like being, if you know that it's a transparent world, then be transparent, because people are gonna find out anyway. Just sort of assume that's the case. Don't think somehow you can do some things and not other things because people won't know, because they're probably gonna know. So, and I think it all comes down to that. You've got a brand promise. You're trying to create this relationship with your customers. And the more authentic you are, the more genuine you are, the more that they trust you, the stronger is the bond that you can create with those customers. So I think that's the main thing to keep in mind. There's always going to be, in any business, some unhappy customers. The nice thing is, if you do so much of the good things, your own customers help out with those unhappy customers in ways that you don't even have to necessarily address. So, I think that's the thing. That assumption and how that drives your behavior and how you kind of operate, you can make life a lot easier for yourself if you just recognize that things are transparent, and that's the way I'm going to operate. And I want to be genuine. I want to be authentic. I want to be real, and I want to be caring and compassionate towards my customers and my communities in ways that people will appreciate and help build some stronger bonds.
Okay, you start your answer talking about transparency. For some companies, it's very normal to use the transparency, but very often we see some companies trying to avoid the transparency. And of course, these companies will have tons of problems with that. But some people try to hide in the problem. I don't know how they do that, but in your opinion, is there intersection between the branding and the storytelling? How is the power of the storytelling in your opinion?
So the thing with storytelling, I think it's a tool. It's a kind of a branding tool, if you will, that's just a way to kind of help communicate what your brand is about. There are other ways to communicate, and I still believe in, doing all kinds of other different forms of communication. I think understanding your positioning, your strategy, your value proposition, your promise, all of those things need to be well articulated, and often in detail in different ways. The advantage of a story is it can take those inputs and kind of put them together in a way that help people understand how they all fit together in a way they may not have understood otherwise. So I think that's the beauty of storytelling. I think it can be powerful, but I also think you have to make sure it has the underpinnings of the inputs into that story, that they're well articulated, and they're also explained and communicated in other places in other ways. So I don't see it as a substitute for a broader set of marketing communications. I just see it as more of a supplement, something that actually brings in something a little different in terms of my brand building.
I don't know if it happened with you in USA, but for example, here in Brazil, one or two companies started with a good storytelling, but when the light come on, we see that it was just a storytelling, not a whole concept. It was like a sand castle, a castle made of sand at the beach. It was just a storytelling, not the branding, as we know.
You need to have substance, and I totally agree. And that's why it's so important. You can't just tell a story without having the substance, and that's why the way I described it was you've got to have the value proposition. You have to have the promise. You have to have all these pieces that are the substance that you then build on top of it, the story. So instead of just having a story with nothing underneath to your point. So I totally agree.
Okay. In your opinion, is there a difference or synergy between brand management and reputation management?
I think the more you have a corporate brand, then I think reputation plays a very important role. And they're very closely related. The advantage of reputation is you often think about a broader set of constituents than sometimes brand. Even though brand, you tend to focus on customers and employees. And with reputation, you often think of the financial market and some other kind of stakeholders or constituents. So you've got that, that's one of the differences there. And if you're a corporate brand, if I'm a product brand, then there's a little more difference, I think, than kind of a corporate brand. And the thing with reputation is your reputation is kind of a summary judgment. It's like an overall evaluation.
Evaluation.
Whereas with branding, we talk a lot about the importance of perceptions and beliefs.
What the people says about your company.
Yeah. And so I think the reputation, it hones in on a really important concept, and it especially looks at it in a very broad way. I think what branding does is it tends to focus in a little bit more on customers and employees in that company and consumer kind of relationship, but does it in a very rich way, looking at lots of reputation in a lot of evaluations, but a lot of other aspects of what consumers think and feel, and et cetera. But there's obviously a lot of overlap between the two.
Okay. Carol, we are coming to the end of our interview. What recommendation do you give to a young executive who wants to pursue a career in brand management? What's your advice?
Well, I think one is, it's helpful to study it. I think so. The advantages of, whether it's a school, an MBA program or a business program or anything like that, or going to conferences and all that, I think are very helpful. But to me, the best marketers are the ones who really understand consumers. They really care for them. They have an empathy for them. They really sort of just are part of and understand how consumers think and how they feel. So my advice, is that's one of my biggest pieces of advice is you have to develop that mindset and that interest and that philosophy. And to be really successful, I think you have to be able to project yourself in a really meaningful way into how consumers think and feel. And then you need to learn about marketing and develop your philosophy about how it all works, whether through school and through just your own experience and observing. There's so much, you've got a wonderful webinar series here where you're interviewing different people. There are lots of ways to learn. But
please send the link, and I will share with our audience.
The link to what?
For your online and regular course at the time.
Yeah, I don't even know. Unfortunately, I don't have anything online. My course, the course I teach at the Tuck School in the MBA program. So I'm happy to share that link and have anybody come and apply to the Tuck School. And we always have students from Brazil and so, which is always great. So we'd love more. So absolutely.
In a normal conditions, without COVID, we have a lot of Brazilian studying abroad.
Correct. It's definitely different. We have some students even now who have done it, who are online, but I agree. These are different times. But I think that to become really, develop that career. And the thing about it is, it's the other thing I'd say is it's never ending. You're always learning more.
Yeah.
In marketing, you're learning more about consumers, about the marketplace, about competition, the company, how all these things work. And that's why it's such a exciting career, why it's so much fun, and why,
it's a lifelong learning.
Lifelong. I've been doing this for 40 years now, over 40 years. So, and I'm still very excited and very interested in learning more. And so it's never ending. And that's the fun part of branding and marketing.
But when we learn, when we do what we love, it's not a jargon. It's good for us. We are doing what we love.
And I will say, those who choose this career, there's so many people I know in this field of marketing find it so satisfying, enjoy it so much. And it's probably true with, most professions, but I think marketing, certainly it's the art and the science. I think that's what people really like, the creativity with also sort of the discipline, if you will, this blending those. And that's what's so nice about this field. You can see that in certainly other business disciplines, but marketing really, really nicely brings that out, the art and science.
Mr. Keller, I have skipped one question. I forgot that. Just to come to an end. Brazil has brands that are well positioned in several markets, such as, for example, Natura, Beauty and Care. Nowadays, Natura is the company holder of Avon and oh my God, I forgot this. The Body Shop, sorry, Avon and Body Shop. And we have the second global brand, that's Havaianas, that's Flip Flop.
Yep.
Any advice for brands that want to launch themselves in international markets?
So two things. One is, I'll go back to what we talked about earlier. successful brands anywhere, superior delivery, desired benefits, unmet needs and wants. So the more you can find those around the world, better off you are. So point one. Point two, often this is a phased kind of rollout. You have to build a brand, create some interest in a market. You start most brands start small. They start in a region, and they go to the whole country. Then they start looking at other countries, and then they start looking all over the whole world. So, you do it in that kind of way. I think the one thing that's interesting, and even those examples you listed, how much you use the Brazilian association, because if I'm building a brand, it helps if I can leverage what people already know and think. And there's some of that has gone on with those two examples.
Sun, tropical sun, for example.
Yep. Yeah, no, exactly. I think, there's a lot of positive, very positive associations about Brazil as a country, and tapping into that is something that both, I think, in a functional and an emotional sense can be very helpful, but you can't force it. It has to make sense for your product. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You just have to develop it separately, and that's fine. You can do that too.
Okay. Mr. Keller, it was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for your attention. And please, let's keep in touch with your improvements, your new papers, and I will share with our audience, okay?
Okay, that'd be fine. Yeah, let them know about the Tuck School. It's been my pleasure too. It's great to be able to do this and have a chance to have a conversation about branding and have you in Brazil and me in the US. So I think it's great. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Okay.